Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our latest webinar, Inspiring Change, Championing Inclusive Leadership. My name is Jack Island, Content Marketing Executive here at Reed. As you may be aware, at the end of 2022, Reed partnered with the CIPD to produce the Inclusion at Work 2022, which in essence is a survey report that highlighted the need for companies to focus their approach on inclusion and diversity. A part of that report, it delves into the importance of leadership when it comes to I&D. So, over the course of the next hour, our panel experts will explore the results of the report and what senior leaders can do to keep inclusion and diversity at the forefront of the workplace, drawing on their own experience and expertise as we go along. Just before we get started, there is a couple of housekeeping bits we need to make you aware of. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered in the follow-up email after this event, along with a feedback form and some other useful content, which will include a link to the survey report we've just mentioned. Our panel discussion will last roughly about 45 minutes, and at the end you'll have a chance to put your questions to our panelists. To submit your questions, you'll find a chat function in the top right corner of your screen, and we'll try to get through as many of these questions as we possibly can. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome today's speakers. Firstly, we have Hannah Owanaga, Global Head of DEI Colleague Engagement at Barclays. Good afternoon, Hannah.
Hello, hi. Thanks for having me.
Next, we've got Dr. Jill Miller, Senior Policy Advisor for Inclusion and Diversity at the CIPD and the author of the Inclusion at Work report. Good afternoon, Jill.
Hi there.
Ian Nicholas, the Global Managing Director here at Reed. Good afternoon, Ian.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me.
And finally, Sandrika CBE, Race Director at Business in the Community. Good afternoon, Sandra.
Good afternoon, delighted to be here.
Well, thank you all for joining us here today. So without further ado, let's just get started. So leaders have a central role to play in creating a fair, inclusive and diverse organisation with equal opportunities for everyone, regardless of their background, identity or circumstance. So as we've mentioned, the Inclusion at Work report has looked at those sort of findings, and obviously it was based on a survey of over 2,000 senior decision makers in the UK. 23% of respondents agreed that senior leaders feel uncomfortable talking about inclusion and diversity. So why do we think this is, and how can we go about making these discussions easier to have? Hannah, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So great question, and not surprising, to be honest. I'm not sure, though, that it's about making the conversation easier. I think that it's about holding leaders accountable, and about leaders being able to kind of be comfortable being with the uncomfortable. If I think about how we get into leadership, it could be for so many different reasons. It could be that actually you've done a previous role and you were promoted into leadership. It could be that you have multiple different avenues. And so it doesn't automatically make you an inclusive leader. And so therefore, I do think that there is a journey that leaders need to go on, personal. I'm a big advocate that we all have a personal journey with D&I. There's a lot of unlearning, and I talk about unlearning a lot, that we all have to go on that journey. So I don't think it's about making the conversation easier. I think it's about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, understanding where the discomfort is coming from. So it could be that actually you have some inherent biases yourself. It could be that you have some belief systems that then make it difficult for you to address. And so thinking about how do you tackle that? How do you go on a learning journey yourself? So that actually when you are talking about these things, even if you are uncomfortable, you actually acknowledge that and still have the conversation anyway. I don't know if any of the other panelists have a view on that, but that's my thoughts around that.
No, thank you, Hannah. Jill, do you have anything to add on the extension of that?
Yeah, I mean, I would really agree with Hannah's point that just by virtue of being promoted, it doesn't mean you're going to become a great people manager, and the same with EDI. I think we still need to be recognising that leaders need training, need support, ongoing guidance, conversations, and we can start that at every level of the organisation, really, because EDI is everybody's responsibility. But of course, we want leaders to be role modelling to be leading that change. They're the ones who can make the change happen. We need them to step up to do this effectively, but we do need that ongoing support for them to be able to do this, because I think often in having conversations people can feel uncomfortable, and we're not going to move forward on the with EDI if we're not talking about it, and so we need to be supporting people, because often I think there's a fear of saying the wrong thing, and often then people don't say anything. And we just don't have that conversation at work. So I think that is really important to be offering that support there.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to make there, Jill. Ian, obviously based on your experience, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Probably to echo what's been said. I think nobody likes to talk publicly about something they're not an expert in. And I would suggest that a lot of leaders are probably not experts in this topic. So it is being feeling comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think it's a great phrase that Hannah used. So you have to, and you have to learn. I think you probably add to that. I mean, we will have family conversations with my children, and they are growing up with much better education than I had, and certainly my parents had. They're growing up with a much more diverse friendship group. So they're probably more expert in some of this than I am. And I think it's being open to learning, and any leader should just be humble enough to be open to learning and get interested and get involved. I think that would be my advice.
Great, thank you, Ian. And finally, Sandra, do you have anything you'd like to add as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything that the panelists have said, and I would just add, for leaders, you need to be brave, you need to be open, and you need to be honest. Your employers will respect that, and and honest about the fact that you do not know all the answers. And I agree with Ian's point. As a leader, many times you get to the top because you kind of know everything. You're leading from the front. But actually being honest, because everybody knows you don't know all the answers, as do they. Nobody knows all the answers to everything. So I think it's really important to say, I don't know all the answers to this, but I think it's important that we talk about it. So I think that openness and that bravery is really kind of important for leaders, and I think leaders of the future, because I just think it's more ambiguity, more complexity, and part of that you just need to be able to put your hand up and say, I don't know the answers, but I'm prepared to talk, and I think we all need to talk about this.
Great, thank you for that insight there, Sandra. So on the back of that, how can leaders really ensure that inclusivity is embedded across their entire company culture? Jill, would you like to take that one first?
Yes, sure. Well, I think I'd sort of reiterate a point I said before around EDI is not something that can be pursued by the HR team or someone with EDI in their job title alone. It's not just their responsibility. I think sort of they have obviously immense people management specialism, expertise in the area, which is needed to guide the organisation, but ultimately it's the responsibility of everybody within it to make progress here. It's whether you have an inclusive culture, I think, is shaped as much, if not more, by the day-to-day interactions we have, how we talk to each other, how we provide feedback. It's the informal way of operating, just as much as the formal policies are there in place. But that's not to say that something like a strategy isn't important, because I think a strategy is immensely powerful in really setting the expectation of what's a priority, what's really valued here, and what are we accountable for. I mean, in the survey that we did, CIPD in partnership with Reed, we asked a question around, do you have a strategy? And it was under half, so just 48% of employers said that they've got a strategy or an action plan in place. And that could be either a standalone one or part of your wider people strategy, but still it's just under half. And I think that is a really important step to be sort of setting the stall out of what we value here. And then that really as well sort of feeds through into what's expected of leaders, leadership behaviour, and then whether I think there's something about leader job design, and there's leader accountability there as well. So is this part of how performance is judged within the organisation? Are people being held accountable for progress here? Or the other side of things, is EDI just something that's done when we have a lot of resources? I think I'd leave that question there.
Great, thank you, Jill. Ian, anything further to add, especially from obviously what we do here at Reed?
Yeah, lots to add. Yeah, I mean, I can obviously speak about our own experience at Reed of what we've done. I think firstly, and the report actually that Jill and CIPD have put together with us talks a lot about being data-led. So I think in running a business, most of us will have KPIs or a scorecard, or certainly you look at financials on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, etc. So some of the advice I would give would be to build in, we call it inclusion and belonging. It could be inclusion and diversity, equality, whatever you're calling it in your business, but build in those parameters and those measures into your everyday management parameters, if you like, so that it becomes the normal to look at that and look at progress. To do that, you have to collect the data, but that will help you monitor it. My other would be to, as I said earlier, just get involved. So what we've done is we've created an inclusion and belonging calendar that runs through the year. We've got working groups and we've got passionate employees that will get involved in that. And that calendar just sort of makes things happen. So don't be afraid to have people give you a nudge to make sure that you're on the call, that you're celebrating various religious events, whatever it might be. But we have a calendar that runs through the year and that sort of makes that happen. And we set up a Yammer channel, which has had a lot of engagement. And the other thing that we've done very successfully is we have what we call lunch and learns, which the L&D team set up. And they actually set these up during the pandemic when everybody was having to work from home. And we use those a lot for training, for learning and development, and various other things. But they've also been a superb way of engaging co-members. And so a lot of our co-members will have talked very personally about their own experiences. And that's served to educate people and raise awareness. And for myself as well, I've learned an awful lot from my fellow colleagues and co-members about their own experiences. So try and get something that's going and it kind of snowballs, and make sure you've got that calendar as a reminder that you're doing things, as well as building in the data into your day-to-day business. The only other thing I'd like to say would be accreditations, and as leaders we can fund and look at accreditations. The accreditations that for me personally, the best thing about an accreditation is it holds you to account. So don't just do it because you want the badge. Do it because it holds you to account. And a lot of accreditations will have certain commitments that you must make as a company, and it helps to hold you to account. There's lots more I could say, but I don't want to talk too much because we've got other experts on the call that will say a lot better.
Well, thank you anyway, Ian. Sandra, is anything else that you'd like to add on how leaders can ensure inclusivity?
Yeah, I've got three things. So I think policy, so embedding the messages in training from managers, induction of new employees coming on board, training for new promotees, so that you kind of keep repeating those messages around the value of inclusivity for your organization. Jill talked about, the accountability, and I would say, performance objectives, which link to pay. So it actually counts. So managers responsible for really promoting this across their organization. And then I think that, with the policy, then you get the managers and also individual responsibility, which kind of aligns with what Ian has just talked about, for example, having a calendar and getting people involved, but also ensuring that in your narratives, employees know that it's part of the values of the organization. So therefore, we're all responsible for making sure the culture is right and that we're all behaving. It's not just about everyone over there needs to kind of sort themselves out, but part of the narrative of the organization that we want to be, then I will commit to certain behaviours. So I think the more you can also get people to sign up and say, I'm going to stand by this as well, That helps if you need to challenge behaviours that are not in line with the values, because you can say, hey, they're on the wall, we've all kind of signed up to them, and it doesn't become adversarial. It's about us as an organisation and the behaviours we want to see.
Thank you, Sandra. And finally, Hannah, have you got anything you'd like to add?
So not much, because everything's been said so well. I even took some notes myself. But I think for a few things is storytelling and being able to be vulnerable. So sharing stories and allowing others to share stories creates a safe space. And so I think the more stories that you can share, actually you take people on a journey. So you have leaders who will then be really open and will be eye-open, should I say, to people's stories. But then you also have others that, whilst sharing stories, they feel that maybe there's a burden been lifted and they can actually truly become, themselves and bring their whole selves. Another thing that I think is important is this notion of conscious inclusion. So, we often talk a lot about unconscious bias and how it's unconscious, but if you flip it and start to think about things from a conscious inclusion perspective, then actually everything that you do, you bring it to the conscious mind. So whether that's hiring or attraction or developing, if you're consciously thinking about inclusion, then hopefully actually as you start to become a better leader, have bigger teams or even not bigger teams, it's always at the forefront of everything that you do. So I'd really encourage people to be thinking about inclusion from a conscious perspective.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So obviously we've all touched on it a little bit about how this is everybody's responsibility, not just those with the job title. So in your opinion, to what extent do those people in senior positions influence the level of inclusion and diversity that exists within a company? And how can they themselves ensure that they have a positive influence throughout? Ian, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that if you're a leader, then I'd like to think you can influence the direction of your teams in whatever it may be. So as long as you see that inclusion and belonging or inclusion and diversity is really important to your business, of course you will influence it. And that leader might be, say, me as leading the company. I need to lead the way. I want others to follow my direction in that respect. But you might be just a leader of a small team. You're still a leader. And there's lots of leaders in every business. So yeah, I think if every leader shows an interest, shows a genuine desire, because I'm a big believer that diversity in any team will make that team perform better. You want people with different ideas from different backgrounds. So I think any leader can influence others and influence the actions of those others. So, but that's just by showing an interest, but also by setting the agenda, having the measurements in place, putting targets in place, etc., etc.
Great, thank you, Ian. Sandra, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, so I think it's really important, obviously leaders at every level, but absolutely leaders setting that tone from the top. Your behavior can't just be talk. People need to follow through and say, yeah, no, this person's really, walking the talk. I think the second thing would be to ensure that it's in the narrative about your organisation, that you really are kind of committed to this internally and externally. And then I would really encourage leaders to get involved in what we call kind of two-way mentoring, mutual mentoring, having those conversations, the sense checking with people in the organisation. How is it working here? How are things going? So that they get that perspective, not from the top of the table where it's maybe lovely up here, a bit stressful now and again, but not bad, but actually they get to hear firsthand from people in the organisation. And then I would say the second part is, and where you can, follow through on what you hear when you hear challenging things, so that people realise this is not just a talking shop. Actually, things happen if I share with a leader and I see that they're, even if it's on the board agenda now or the leadership team meeting notes, it's been discussed, just to show that this matters.
Great, thank you, Sandra. Hannah, would you agree with the statement? Obviously, action is obviously very important in this scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I have anything to add. I think that, you know, role modeling inclusive behaviors is really important. So, you know, people are leaders, you know, we say leaders should be role models in the business. And so actually, if you're thinking about how can we ensure that our teams are inclusive, or how can we ensure that people feel safe, actually it should come right from the top. And so we know that, especially from a speak up perspective, we often say this is a safe space, but it's one thing to say it and another thing to demonstrate it and lead by it and give people that safety. So that they're the only things I wanted to add. And also just to be transparent, that it's not easy. It's not easy to create or be role models. And to going back to my first point about personal journeys, I think it's important that leaders do the work that they need to do before they can really be true role models in the organisation.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And finally, Jill, based on your experience and what you've seen in your sort of roles through time, is anything else you'd like to add?
I think first I just wanted to pick up on something both Ian and Sandra said. I think Ian used the word genuine and Sandra was saying, I wrote down committed. And I think this is really important, because I think people will very quickly see if leaders' engagement with EDI and their commitment to it is tokenistic, or whether they are actually dedicated, whether it's just words, or when Sandra was talking about action and the importance there. So I think that is a really good point. But my final thing I thought I would mention was the need for leaders to assume the work will never be done. It's never finished. I think inclusive organisation needs constant maintenance. And as I suppose the world changes, the economy changes, the marketplace, the labour market, we need to be constantly adapting and changing our approaches as the world is moving on.
Great, thank you, Jill. So going back to the survey report, which we mentioned, quite an astounding stat here is that 15% of leaders still don't understand how an inclusive workplace and diverse workforce can benefit an organisation. How can we go about addressing this? Sandra, would you like to hit that one first?
Yeah, so I'm surprised or not, actually. I think that's what I find, and I think we have to keep continuing when you're starting to engage in this conversation, remembering everyone's at a different starting point. So you've got to keep, even though you think, why do I have to kind of spell it out? Don't we all get it? Well, actually, don't assume. I think we should kind of continue to make the case for change. I think where you can illustrate there's a income boost to your organization, look at the changing phase of customers and clients. What does that mean to the difference and how you need to then show up? Any case studies of how that has really made a change, brings it to life for people. I've heard of customers and people being thrown out when it's like, no, we need a diverse kind of group pitching this. So sometimes any kind of real life scenarios, highlighting the change of demographics. So we've just published some ethnicity kind of by region fact sheets using some census data and research data that shows how that is changing. So what does that mean for engaging with talent pools locally and nationally? And then it is the right thing to do, and picking up stories of impact. So how, your commitment, how that behavior, and I would say a mixture of maybe positive and not so positive stories, where necessary to challenge people to say, look, we cannot afford to sit down. This is out of our employee survey. This came out of somebody from our organisation, so that people are alive to great opportunities, but challenges as well.
Great, thank you, Sandra. Hannah, do you want to weigh in on your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sandra covered most of it. I think the only thing for me is just linking it back to the business, because sometimes DEI is seen as that thing over there that we have to do. And to Jill's point, the work is never done. We should all not have, well, in the D&I space, we shouldn't have jobs, because actually we should all be inclusive. But we know that actually the work is continuous. And so I would say linking it back to business priorities is a really important metric. So you need to think about your clients and your customers and how, to the point Sandra made, the demographics are changing. If you are an organization that is a service-based or client-facing, your customers are changing and their needs are changing. And so even if we just think about it from a generational perspective, the generations are expectant of things that we would have never dreamed of, even as, less as 10 years ago. So, it's a really relevant conversation. And so when you are having business strategy meetings about how you are going to increase profit, you need to be thinking about DEI as well. You need to be thinking about the changing demographics and how you can best serve your clients and customers and your people ultimately, because we're clients as well, right? We're customers as well. So that's the only thing I would have added is just linking it back to the business priorities.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And Jill, obviously, as the author of the report, you must have been pretty taken aback by that stat.
Yeah, because I mean, 15%, it's obviously more than 1 in 10. And I think there's some key things there which other presenters have also drawn out that I would just echo really about. I think Hannah mentioned about sort of linking back to business priorities, and I think that is really, really important. I think things like recruiting for key skills, we know cost control is a priority for many businesses, as to customer interaction, service delivery, and so on. And so how do we link EDI to how that can help a business tackle some of these real key priorities at the moment? And I think having those kind of framed conversations can really help to move things forward.
Great, thank you, Jill. And finally, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I'm a big supporter of getting views from different backgrounds, from different people. One of the things we've done that I was really pleased with a couple of years ago, we introduced a shadow board. So we wanted people who right at the front line of our organisation to play a big role, and they have contributed hugely since we introduced that. So it's getting people's views from different backgrounds. So having a diverse workforce or diversity within your team can only benefit you from a business, because they will give you different views and different perspectives. I'm a big fan of that. I also genuinely believe it makes for a happier workforce. It's incredibly rewarding when I've spoken to people in Reed and they genuinely feel they can be themselves at work, and that is incredibly rewarding. And then you hope that that is the case in every single one of your 70 odd sites. But my God, you have to keep working at it. But that is rewarding, and it does make for happier people, and that means that they will perform and be effective in their jobs. And it's particularly important at the moment. I mean, in most sectors, there is a real candidate shortage. There is a real battle for talent. So more than ever, you need to be retaining that talent or attracting that talent. And I genuinely believe that people care about ED&I, so they will be looking at the culture. I think it came up earlier, or I think it might be about to come up, so I'm about to ruin the next question, perhaps, I don't know, but about paying lip service. You can't pay lip service these days. Social media, sites, etc. You can't pretend that that's your culture. The truth will come out, so you have to keep working at these things.
Great, thank you for that, Ian. So obviously you mentioned it slightly there, that the report found that 21% of employers agreed that senior leaders are just paying lip service to I&D in their organisation. So let's discuss a couple of sort of best practice tips that you have for leaders who are looking to make a real difference out there. Jill, do you want to take that one first?
Yes, sure. I think it's a really good question with sort of thinking about these sort of practical tips, practical things that we can do. I think sort of it comes back for me to what we've discussed earlier as well about sort of what do we see as leaders' roles? So do we see EDI as a key part of their role? Not just done by what another panelist said about it's something that happens over there. I don't know if that was from you, Hannah, which I thought was really quite insightful. So it has to be a key part of everybody's role, but leaders to really lead that change. And it's got to be a constant for people as they progress up, where people receive the training, receive the support. It's really clear what's acceptable, what's not acceptable within the business. But also for personal responsibility of upskilling yourself, in terms that we talked about whether people feel comfortable talking about EDI. But without this upskilling, we're not going to move forward.
Great, thank you, Jill. Sandra, you got anything else to add on just paying lip service and a couple of best practice tips that senior leaders can make to make a difference in their organisation?
I'm so glad you asked. I think, have you signed the Race at Work Charter? For an example, public commitment, because there is something about being public. If you're setting targets or you've got a public commitment to say we are not messing about here, we are prepared to go public and be accountable for driving change and make sure it's happened. The second thing is not just sign that just to, oh, I feel a bit of pressure. The Race at Work Charter survey is open at the moment. If you signed it, have you completed the survey? Are you going to? A great opportunity to demonstrate to your employees that we are serious, and to spotlight some good practice or good stories of engagement in your organization that will inspire people. And then the third thing I would say, not just those things, but follow through with some advisory group or council, to build up that accountability so you're not alone and just say that and then do nothing, but draw from people within the organization. This can work whether an organization is large or small. Get key people who are passionate about it to hold you to account on the things that you've said you're going to do. Progress. So for just using the charter, what progress are you making against those commitments? And any other public statements that you make, because I think leaders mustn't underestimate that silence at the wrong time, when something kicks off or something's important, silence just makes people think you're not serious, or that potentially you're in agreement with whatever negative thing is going on in the public domain. So I think public commitments with follow through and action.
Great, thank you, Sandra. And Hannah, your best practice tips?
So I wanted to just touch on allyship, and actually active allyship, because I think actually there's something about leaders nowadays. We hear, they are an ally, and then when you ask them what they do, they say they turn up to events. Now, please, I'm not trying to say that that is not an important thing, and it is important to be active and to show your participation. But real active allyship for me, there's 3 P's: privilege, power, and position. How do you use your privilege? How do you use your power? And how do you use your position to help another person, to help others? So I would definitely say active allyship is really important. It's about making sure that you are doing things that is going to help others. How do you use your privilege? How do you use your position? If you are a senior leader in the organisation, what doors are you opening for others? When the whole George Floyd thing happened, a lot of people called me to ask me how I am. Now, that was nice, right? But actually, on reflection, I would have liked people to call me and say, well, what can I do to help you? Where are you now? What's your story? What can we do to drive it forward, if it's career progression or if it's anything else? It's the active bit that I think is really important. And then that leads on to sponsorship. Often we hear about mentorship, and mentorship is great. Some of us may, some people may say that they're mentored out, actually, and actually what they need is the opportunity. They need the doors open. They need somebody to vouch for them. And so they're the 2 key things for me: active allyship and sponsorship.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And obviously, Ian, you touched on this in the previous question, but do you have anything further that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I really liked Sandra's point about being made held to account, because we don't want to let anybody down. And in a leadership role, if you're very public about something, you're then going to have to hold yourself to account. So I mentioned that with the accreditation. So we did sign the Race at Work Charter. I think we were one of the first signatories. So it's exciting that, I think, Sandra, you were instrumental in that. But there's other things. So we're disability confidence employer, and that gives you commitments that you must do. For example, guaranteed interviews if people meet requirements. So that's a good one. Inclusive employer standard, for people on the call that might not have heard of that. We've recently embarked on that and been accredited with that. And that kind of is quite an evidence-based across numerous things, but it also has given us an action plan of where we can improve. So we can build an action plan of where we can improve. And we're a mindful employer as well. So that's to do with mental health and being open around mental health. So there's lots of accreditations that you can do. I think also just generally, my point earlier about social media and people's communications, it's more open now than ever. So the proof of the pudding is actually how your people do feel in every location, on every site. We're a big organisation. I was talking to Hannah, her organisation's even bigger, and it's really hard to try and make sure you've got that right culture, that right environment across every area. It only takes one bad egg to dilute that. So yeah, I think there's some good advice from the panel on that.
Great, thank you, Ian. And just to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier about how people are really caring about ED&I at the moment. So if you look at the report findings again, 23% of senior decision makers agree with the statement that a lot of senior leaders wrongly believe they already have an inclusive and diverse organisation. So what are some of the common misconceptions that leaders can have about how diverse and inclusive their company actually is, and how can we actually measure this? Hannah, would you like to take that one?
Yes, I was thinking about this, and often there's this, what some people may describe as this illusion of inclusion. This whole, when you talk about something for so long, people then think that, oh, okay, well, we've talked about race for 3 years, so we can move on from that right now. Or people talk about diversity and inclusion, and then leaders and people start to think, well, I've got other things to get on with, other priorities. But then when you strip it back and you look at the numbers haven't moved. The dial still hasn't moved. So you can get into this illusion that actually we've been talking about D&I for so long, and so surely the dial has moved. But when you go to data, and so our last point was not being data led, and I think Ian made that point earlier. If you are not rooted in data, then it's very easy for you to assume that you're doing so much work because you have events every week and you're doing all of that stuff. The engagement stuff is really important, but when you strip it back, if the data is not telling you that is moving the dial, then actually that's where the real issue is. So for me, it was about, understanding this illusion of inclusion. We all have it, right? You talk about something for so long, you start to think that, okay, well, we've been doing so much stuff, until you peel it back and realize actually not actually doing a lot. And so then for also having, what we said right at the beginning, which is sometimes people are shying away from having tough conversations. And so that's not leading to real action and real results, because you're not getting under the skin of what's really happening, whether it's racism or discrimination or accessibility. If you're not having them conversations, then actually on the surface, it could feel really great. It could feel like everything's going well. But if you're not having the tough conversations, there's going to be people in your business who don't feel like they are included. And so they are some of the things that came up for me.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And Jill, any sort of misconceptions that you've come across?
I think sort of just by the nature of how many organisations are structured, many organisations are multi-site. And I think, Ian, you brought up the sort of the fact that you have to work on EDI in every part of your business, no matter where it is. And I think sometimes maybe that if something's happening at head office in a business, that can feel quite inclusive. But then we've got to think of all the people that work on different sites who are maybe out in the field, who work remotely. How do those people feel? Do they feel included? Do they feel there's equality of opportunity? And it's a real challenge. How do we ensure we're reaching out to everybody? But I think what Hannah said is really important about data. And I think that is a hugely important tool to really help us understand what's happening, and then to challenge misconceptions. So I know we have employee survey data in many organisations, but also we have a lot of workforce data that perhaps isn't being utilised or drawn insights out from. So things like, what are exit interviews telling you? What's who's applying for jobs, who's not applying, who gets called for interview, who actually gets selected, who's progressing up the organisation. Are different groups progressing at the same rate or at different rates? Where are those barriers that we need to actively remove that are stopping people having equality of opportunity? So I think that data and evidence is really, really important.
Great, thank you, Jill. Yeah, I completely agree with sort of the metrics there that are in place. Ian, anything else you'd like to add?
I think it's been mostly covered, to be honest. I haven't really got anything else to add on that point, Jack, to be honest.
It's not a problem. Anybody else? Sandra, have you got anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, just to say, I was ticking off my list that Jill and Hannah mentioned. So all I have that they haven't mentioned is about looking at disparities around performance and, you know, reward, recognition, complaints, and disciplinary. Using the evidence to say, because it's so easy. Many leaders, oh, I haven't got any problems here. Prove it. Let's look at the data and look at that. So those are the things that it is a huge data bit to just wake people up. And then you add the stories from people's voices to say, this is not, you know, this is happening here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sandra. And finally, sort of the last sort of discussion point for our panelists. It's often the case that larger organizations have a lot more time and resource to dedicate towards this specific topic. So I just want to know what your thoughts are on this and what business leaders who obviously run smaller, sort of medium-sized enterprises, what they can do to have the greatest impact. Is there anybody else that I'd like to take this question first?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, with a smaller organization, make sure you've got a policy so it's clear to whoever, how many employees, this is what we stand for. Have, you know, and schedule check-in conversations with people who have joined your organization to ensure that they're feeling their voice is heard and they're included, because I think data can be captured. It doesn't have to always be numbers. It can be through conversations as well. And then almost as we started at the beginning or talked about earlier, making sure that the case for why it matters is in the narrative, is in any online presence that you have, and that everybody new coming into your organization knows what those kind of behaviors are, what those values are, so that you can make sure you're bringing in people who are going to help to enhance that brand and help enhance that reputation. So I know it can sound like it's really a big organization thing, but I think small organizations need to be taking these actions as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, Hannah. I was just going to say that in some respects, obviously, the leader can make a bigger influence in a small company. So it's back to that advice that the panel were giving earlier about don't be afraid to get involved, because you can make a big difference. The only other thing I would add is maybe, and I accept that might be an investment for a company, but to get initial advice, to get set up on policies, best practice and what have you, you could seek external help or maybe get a consultancy in or somebody just to get you set up. But then it's a case of just rolling and making it business as usual. Sorry, Hannah, over to you.
No, absolutely. I was just going to echo actually. So what's your business case? No matter how big or small your size is, the size of your organization, you can be clear on the why. And often smaller businesses, maybe you can't be data led, maybe the numbers are not huge, but you can be clear on your vision and your values and the business case for DEI. And then instead of being data led, you could be research led. So there's so much research out there that tells you why, from industry to industry to different organizations, different regions. So be research led, do the work, you know, understand your demographics. And then the last point is just about being consciously inclusive. So small actions that you can take every day, all of you in your organization, that can have a positive impact on the rest of your workforce, but also your clients and customers.
And just to add in there, sort of, I think a point we bring out in the report where we talk about this question, so I'm so pleased you've asked it, in that there's often some sort of really inexpensive things that small businesses can do to make their people management approach really inclusive. And I think sort of small businesses can often be an advantage in this respect, because we can build EDI into a people management approach when it's being first designed. That would be sort of an ideal. But things like standard interview questions, standardized ones, objective scoring criteria, things like this we can do. Looking at a job description, something which is part and parcel of recruitment, but actually, is our job description actually reflecting the skills that we want someone to have within the job role? What skills do they actually need? Because I think by virtue of designing job descriptions, often they seem to get longer and longer and longer the more often we hire, as we add in, oh, we'd love them to be able to do this, or we want someone who can have this skill, and it gets quite a long list. But ultimately, this could mean, when we talk about neurodiversity, especially, that if somebody has deep level skills in certain areas, we may be not attracting those people to work for the business because they can't tick off every item we've put on a long job description. So in effect, what we could do is making it clear what skills are must-haves for the role and which are nice to haves. So some simple things like that could make a big difference. And again, as Ian said, sort of leaders in a smaller organisation see people often much more regularly than you would in a larger organisation, and so role modelling that behaviour, I think, is really, really important.
Great, thank you, Jill, and thank you for all the panelists for lending your expertise on this subject. So we've got around 15 minutes left to take some questions that have come through from the Q&A section. So essentially, these will be open questions, so I'll just ask them to the group, and if you feel like you've got something that you'd like to say or contribute, feel free to do so. The first one is actually directly for you, Jill. Someone has asked, they've always talked in terms of D&I, so they are just wanting to understand what the E stands for in EDI.
Yes, sure. I mean, at CIPD, we talk about equality, diversity and inclusion. And we call out equality really as being about outcomes. So we add that in that. We used to talk about equality within inclusion, but now we call it out specifically because this is about outcomes, about whether people feel they've got equal opportunity at work, people are treated fairly. But in the survey itself, we were really interested in what terms other organisations use. And really the top 5 I've just noted down here, which are inclusion, respect, diversity, equality, and fairness. So I just thought that was quite interesting to sort of to talk about. But I know before there's been lots of conversation as well about what the E stands for in terms of, is it equality, is it equity? And I just wondered if one of the other panelists as well might take a different approach from what we do.
Yes, I can share. So from our perspective, we introduced equity into our DEI strategy last year. And when I speak about DEI, the E for me is very much about equity. Equity and equality for me is they're used interchangeably, but they're actually very different. So equality is about giving people the same opportunity, whereas equity is about giving people what they need to thrive. So it's understanding the nuances. It's understanding that we're not all starting from a level playing field. If we treated everybody the same, there would still be some people that would be disadvantaged and some people that would be advantaged. And so equity for me is really important because it almost says, I see you. I actually see that you have nuances, that, you know, you have particular challenges that may make it difficult for you, may make it more challenging for you in the workplace and in society. So that's the equity, and that's what it means for me.
Great, thank you for that, Hannah, and Jill, for your comments as well. So the next question looks at how do we ensure that our leadership team are demonstrating EDI at board level. Ian, is this something that you could contribute?
Yeah, I think we've probably talked about it already, but we've talked about the fact that we need to have data. We've talked about we need to have measures. I would say on data, because I was actually asking advice from the panel the other day when we met, because we have clients that have struggled with collection of data. because they're worried about, can I ask that question? Can I ask for that information? And the advice that we've always had is that you should be very open and honest about why you're collecting the data, and people will be receptive to that. The only other thing with the board level point is we've done board sponsorship of various activities. So again, it's just making sure that they're visible, that they're seen to be doing things. And I think Sandra mentioned it, don't do nothing. Just keep being visible, keep making sure that people see that we do genuinely care about this, that we're authentic about it.
Great, thank you. Somebody else has asked that they've heard that the term BAME or BME is now not recommended for use. So they're asking, what do you think we should use? They've heard some people using the term global majority. Sandra, you've got an opinion on this one?
Yeah, I was waiting for that question. So can I say, but I really just want to amplify what Ian just said about leaders. Even tell little progress, you've had a conversation, this is in train, don't wait. Sometimes people think, oh, it's not big enough to share. It does matter, just that little drip feed of information so they realize this is on the leadership agenda. We talked about it this morning. It doesn't matter, small steps. So on the BAME thing, this came out of the Inclusive Britain piece, but there was a noise around it before, don't call me BAME. And this is really about the kind of clapping everyone together. The census has different categories, and we use that as a benchmark because we can track progress against it. But in our Big Race at Work survey, I've asked the question 3 times, what do you want to be called? And in 2021, the short version is Black people, call me Black, Asian people, call me Asian, mixed race, call me mixed race or mixed heritage. I mean, I did a little booklet, Let's Talk About Race. Please just Google it, it's free. You can have a look and just see what the evidence says. And even if, and I'm going to, when I do global conversations, I find I have to use people of color because that travels kind of better globally. But actually, whether we use global majority, because some people don't like the term minority, it is about the clubbing of everybody together in a big hodgepodge rather than recognize actually there's a nuance by different backgrounds. So I would say, spell it out if you can. I'm using ethnically diverse until somebody shouts no, because it gets rid of the minority word and it demonstrates that actually it's a real kind of complex picture. But that's if I am talking about everyone. Other than that, if it's Black people from an African background, I'm going to talk about that. Or if it's somebody from a Pakistani background, I'm going to talk about that. So I just think find the terminology, and I would say those of you concerned about offending your employees, because that's usually, I don't know, to ask them what terminology do you want, and as long as they're happy, then that's fine. Go with that, whatever they say, go with that.
Great, thank you, Sandra. Hannah, probably one for you here. You mentioned in the discussion earlier the term sponsorship. Somebody would just like you to elaborate what that means in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I describe both sponsorship and mentorship for me is mentorship is about guided support, somebody that you can go to, that you can speak to about maybe challenges that you're going through in your career, maybe your career trajectory, maybe, ideas about career planning. For me, a sponsor is somebody who you identify as being able to help you get to where you need to get to. So essentially, it could be somebody who is in a department that you may want to be in the next 18 months. And so you build a relationship with that person for them to be able to ultimately vouch for you. So often they say a sponsor will open doors for you and a mentor will guide you to the door. So I think hopefully that's helpful. But in this context, if you are a sponsor, you're using your own social capital, your professional capital that you've built from your own career to help somebody else get another opportunity. And it's the get the opportunity bit that I like to emphasize, because it is about actually helping people mobilize in their careers.
Great, thank you for that, Hannah. Just one we can open to the panelists here. So how do you ensure that you're being inclusive when you are potentially dealing with sort of the less obvious things such as sexual orientation, disabilities, even carers, etc.? What sort of practices can people put in place in that sort of environment?
Should I chip in first? I'm just going to say,
Fine.
for me, a lot of this comes back to just having that very open culture and making people aware that you're encouraging people to disclose a disability and that we will be supportive of that, or to talk about sexuality and we will be supportive of that. We talk about belonging in Reed, and we did a lot of work with our co-members and what was important to them, and that sense of belonging to the company. And a lot of people have got their best friends in the workplace, so that was really important to us. So I think it's just being about very, very clear that you're being open, that this is all good, and people should be able to be themselves in the workplace. Don't know if Hannah or Sandra, anybody else has, or Jill has anything to add?
I was going to just add that I think the conversation piece, so kind of just the same as Ian, about having these conversations, because when we asked in our survey about talking about race, we also asked about talking about sexuality, age, gender, social background, religion, so many different topics. And, you know, the gist was people are on different levels of comfort. But as long as the space for the conversation, and this bit around the having advisory groups, having people to help to inform what you might do next. But also, I would always say as leaders, what really matters when you're having these conversations is that you're prepared to follow through with some action, and take, you know, on advice, but make sure that it's not just kind of people talk to you and then nothing changes at all. So the conversation, keeping that door open and demonstrating that you've listened by what you follow through with in your behaviour.
I think I'd just to add one point, I think, to the discussion, because I think some good points have been raised already. But I tend to think of sort of EDI in terms of 3 different levels. So I suppose what we need to do as a business to enable diversity, inclusion, equality of opportunity for different employee groups. So on that level, but then some things we can do that are beneficial to many different groups, like things like good people management, flexible working, because people don't just have one identity, one background or circumstance. We've got to think about intersectionality. But then the third level is through, and none of these are more important than the other one really, because we've got to remember that groups are made up of individuals, and what helps one individual perform at their best at work and feel included and ensures equality can be very different from another individual within the same sort of employee grouping that we tend to talk about in EDI. So I think it's really important to not lose sight that a workforce is made up of individual people who will all have their own preferences, their own needs and so on. We need to respond to that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jill, and everyone else who responded to that question. This is quite an interesting one. I know Ian touched on it earlier about having a consultancy group in to maybe help with this, but this is aimed at the panel. Would you recommend creating a bit of an employee steering group to help give the organisation a direction of travel when it comes to D&I?
We've got working groups. I mentioned earlier, we've got working groups in several areas. Whether that be LGBTQ+ or whatever the areas are, race and ethnicity. I do think they're really helpful. I mean, and again, as a leader, I'm not scared to say that somebody might need to give me a nudge on things, because otherwise there's lots going on. So I certainly think it's a good idea to have people that are focused on it, and then they can pull people in to help, or they can give leaders a nudge on when they need to be doing their bits. They can track things. So getting people that are passionate about topics to help lead and steer is a good thing, I think.
We're all agreeing, Ian. It is absolutely power. You know, it's about employee voice. Feel like I belong. My contribution is valued. What I think about is valued. So absolutely great for retention as well.
Yeah, and the important bit there, I think that you mentioned about being valued, Sandra. I think that is really, really important, in that if we're going to set up a steering group or set up employee resource groups and so on, then it's really important that the organisation is listening. It's not just a tokenistic thing to do.
Great, thank you everyone. And probably a final question here, just before we surmise. Any advice on guidance on terminology, especially to know what to use and what they can use across their business? Obviously, we've floated the terms equality, equity, diversity, inclusion and belonging, which is what we use here at Reed, is as a starting point, where can people go to and sort of figure out what would work best for them? Ian, would you like to give a bit of a comment on this one?
I liked Sandra's point earlier about ask the employees. I thought that was a really good point. Equity and equality, Hannah gave a really good definition. That we cover that in our training. So we have both compulsory, mandatory training, and we have training on unconscious bias, etc. There's some really good training about equity and equality, and some really good graphics that just kind of simply show you the difference. So there are things that you need to understand. Other than that, I think again it's all about being diverse, inclusive, and creating the right environment. So how you frame that is probably quite an individual thing to the business. I don't know whether others on the panel agree or not on that.
Yeah, I think your sort of consulting point is really important here, Ian. Ask people within the organisation, and what Sandra said as well, but also to ensure that people understand what the terms mean, and if not, feel able to ask, because I think even through this conversation, what's been highlighted, which is really useful, is that there are many different terms, all different meanings, and what is most suitable. So I think opening up that conversation can really help with the understanding as well. Great,
thank you everyone. I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you to all of our panelists for giving up their time to take part in this discussion. I hope all you online found the conversation very useful, and you can take back to your business and start making those sort of changes. Like I said earlier, we will be in touch shortly with an email containing a link to the Inclusion at Work 2022 survey report for those who haven't already downloaded it, and a recording of today's webinar. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take the time to complete our feedback form, which will be in the email, and this will help us keep improving our webinars as we move forward into the future. As you can see on the screen, if you do scan the QR code, it will take you to our events page on reed.com, or you can reach out to your specialist Reed consultant to find out more events that we're running in the near future. So thanks again to all the panelists, and thanks you for joining. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.